Hi, this is John the Rosenhead, Jerusalem psychotherapist. This week's Torah and Psychology post, Kedoshim, is titled "How Quickly Can a Person Change?" We learned that there's this account of how a ger came to Rabbi Akiva or to Hillel, different interpretations, that he asked and said, "I will convert if you can just teach me the whole Torah." And Rabbi Akiva responded saying that he quotes the pasuk in this week's parsha of "V'ahavta l're'echa kamecha," that you should love your neighbor like yourself. And as we know, this is the famous saying of this is the overriding principle. This is a Zeh Klal Godel b'Torah. This is a all-encompassing principle that can explain the Torah. Whereas Hillel deviates slightly from this and says that he said to the ger that what is hated to you, do not do to other people. The rest is just explanation and literature. Go and learn. And we can take this account, and it's very interesting. There can be a number of questions that we can ask on this. Firstly, is how can a person make such a sudden change, a huge, significant change, where they can change their entire life to convert and to take on the obligations of Torah and mitzvahs? It's a huge obligation and a dramatic change, where they leave one kind of life, the way that they lived up until now, and start a new type of life, a new way of living. Such a change cannot happen in just a moment, that a person, or whether it's Rabbi Akiva or Hillel, they stand on one foot and they just explain that this is what the Torah is all about, and now you can convert. Changing and making change is a lot longer process. Number two is we can ask also on the fact that Rabbi Akiva and Hillel presented such a simple argument, perhaps, saying, "V'ahavta l're'echa kamecha," don't do what is hated to you, do not do to others. The Torah is a wisdom which is so deep and touches on so many in every aspect of our life, and it requires a lifetime of effort. It requires effort and a commitment and a depth of understanding in order to say that you've acquired even a certain amount of knowledge of Torah. So certainly we could ask and say, how can it be that just this one simple statement is enough to suggest that this is a representation of the entire wisdom of the Torah? And thirdly, we can ask on this slight change between the response of Rabbi Akiva and Hillel, with Rabbi Akiva suggesting that "V'ahavta l're'echa kamecha," of loving your neighbor like yourself, which is perhaps a more positive message, whereas Hillel slightly shifting it and deviates from this and presenting a more negative, perhaps, message of focusing on not doing what is hated. And what is the significance of this change? So if we look at from a psychological perspective, at these questions. Number one, when we ask how can a person make such a quick change, there is a tendency for people when they want to make a change that they're trying to search for a quick change, an immediate change. They're impatient, they're impetuous, impulsive. People can lack the patience and the ability to be patient to see a process of change through from the beginning to the end, and there are many regressions, and they stop and they start. There is certainly a desire to make change in your life, but making it into a successful process is very difficult. But what we can say is we look at different theories of change. Often what we look at and we see is that there's a ongoing process of thinking about change, of considering the pros and cons, of trying and stopping and starting and trying to identify the reasons and the boundaries and what's stopping a person from making a change. This is the contemplation, or this is the process that takes place until you get up to the point of making this switch. And the switch in your mindset actually can happen in just one moment. The actual moment of change, the moment where you get to that point of saying, yes, I am going to change, it really is just a switch, a moment where there's a change of perspective and how you understand and conceptualize the problem or the situation that you're in. So yes, it can take a long time, but that moment where you make that decision, that switch, can happen in a very short moment. And this is what we see from the ger that comes to Rabbi Akiva, to Hillel. This is the switch. They hear something they want to change. They had maybe a whole process of building up to wanting to become Jewish and take on the commitments of a Jewish life. Then the switch happens. When they've spoken to Rabbi Akiva, to Hillel, this can happen. It is possible. And the second question, so if we move on, so what is so convincing or so compelling about the response of Rabbi Akiva and Hillel that makes this switch, this change possible? So if we look at wisdoms, if we look at wisdom and theories and understandings in the world, in the secular world and in the world over the history of time. Wisdom and understandings and conceptualizations can change from generation to generation, from context to context. It really can be certainly dependent on the time or the place or the situation. And it doesn't necessarily have an ability or a quality to represent some overriding understanding and wisdom. And this is where the Torah is different. This is where the Torah is special. That the Chachma and the wisdom of the Torah is something that it doesn't require a long, complex explanation. If we look at theories, in terms of also scientific literature and research, the more complex and the more difficult it is to explain, the less in a sense valid it is. And from a scientific perspective, there's a parsimonious approach that often the best understanding is something which is the simplest and easiest to understand and explain. This has the greatest quality. So we take the wisdom of the Torah, if it's something which is a principle that can be explained in the simplest way, whether it's Rabbi Akiva's V'ahavta l'orecha kamecha zeh klal gadol b'Torah, or the explanation of Hillel of not doing something which is hated to you, to other people, it's a simple principle. This is a parsimonious approach that suggests there is some godliness and some greater wisdom to the Torah. And certainly from a scientific perspective, or if we look at experts, there is so much more that you can learn. When Hillel says, go and learn, there's more to learn. Yes, an expert can gain greater knowledge, and certainly there's a lot of wisdom that can be found in the Torah. But if you look at what an expert can do, they're able to explain something which is difficult in the simplest and most basic way. It's using simple principles as well. This is what we see as a convincing and compelling argument of Hillel or Rabbi Akiva. Thirdly is, what is this deviation then of Hillel? Let's take of Hillel from Rabbi Akiva. You could say that the positive approach of V'ahavta l'orecha kamecha is something which is more praiseworthy. It's certainly which could be a good quality of trying to focus on the positive, focusing on doing things which are positive and to love your neighbor. But it's perhaps more difficult. The change in this switch and the compelling, convincing argument perhaps of Hillel is that he's choosing, or Rabbi Akiva and Hillel, is that they're both choosing a focus on relationships, interpersonal relationships, or intrapersonal as well. If the relationship that you have with other people, the relationship that you have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the relationship that you have with yourself. It's taking this whole idea of relationships, which is something which is easy to appreciate. It's something which is relevant. It's something which is close to us. It's something which is applicable and relevant to everybody. It's something that people can work on and understand. And therefore, this change that comes about is because it's picking a concept which is easy to understand and relevant to the person. And Hillel perhaps is saying that what is more perhaps easier to understand is this idea of not doing something which is hated to you, do not do to other people. Because in an ideal world, we want to encourage positive relationships and love and closeness and healthy relationships. But that's perhaps it's a different skill set, perhaps a more complex and a different level of relationships. But focusing on the basic understanding of not doing something which is hated to you, to other people, is something which is perhaps easier and closer to be easier to obtain. This is what Hillel is saying. That he's saying that this is perhaps from a psychological perspective, it's also the change, or we can see in the literature of traditional psychological understanding and literature focusing on negative functioning and trying to help a person to overcome this negative functioning or maladaptive behavior or thoughts. This is traditional psychology. Only recently, if we see the growth of positive psychology, we can see that there is a focus and a value of focusing on the positive aspects of functioning. But they're different concepts, they're different fields in literature, in the understanding from a psychological perspective, and this is the dynamic of Rabbi Akiva and Hillel. And if we take these three questions that we had, and we take these three psychological explanations, we can understand, therefore, how a person can make a change so quickly and it can be effective and successful. Have a great Shabbos and keep well.